The Enduring Relevance of Enoch Powell, Part 3, Rivers of Blood. This speech was given at the Conservative Political Centre, Birmingham, on Saturday 20th of April 1968. Some sections have been condensed for brevity. The Birmingham Speech, or Rivers of Blood. The supreme function of statesmanship is to provide against preventable evils. In seeking to do so, it encounters obstacles which are deeply rooted in human nature. One is that, by the very order of things, such evils are not demonstrable until they have occurred. At each stage in their onset, there is room for doubt and for dispute whether they be real or imaginary. By the same token, they attract little attention in comparison with current troubles, which are both indisputable and pressing. Whence the besetting temptation of all politics to concern itself with the immediate present at the expense of the future. Above all, people are disposed to mistake predicting troubles for causing troubles, and even for desiring troubles. If only, they love to think, if only people wouldn't talk about it, it probably wouldn't happen. Perhaps this habit goes back to the primitive belief that the word and the thing, the name and the object, are identical. At all events, the discussion of future grave but, with effort now, avoidable evils is the most unpopular and at the same time the most necessary occupation for the politician. Those who knowingly shirk it deserve, and not infrequently receive, the curses of those who come after. A week or two ago, I fell into conversation with a constituent, a middle-aged, quite ordinary working man employed in one of our nationalised industries. After a sentence or two about the weather, he suddenly said, "If I had the money to go, I wouldn't stay in this country. I have 3 children, all of them been through grammar school, and 2 of them married now with family. I shan't be satisfied till I have seen them all settled overseas. In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man." I can already hear the chorus of execration. How dare I say such a horrible thing? How dare I stir up trouble and inflame feelings by repeating such a conversation? The answer is that I do not have the right not to do so. Here is a decent, ordinary fellow Englishman, who in broad daylight in my own town says to me, his Member of Parliament, that his country will not be worth living in for his children. I simply do not have the right to shrug my shoulders and think about something else. What he is saying, thousands and hundreds of thousands are saying and thinking. Not throughout Great Britain, perhaps, but in the areas that are already undergoing the total transformation to which there is no parallel in 1,000 years of English history. In 15 or 20 years, on current trends, there will be in this country 3.5 million Commonwealth immigrants and their descendants. That is not my figure. That is the official figure given to Parliament by the spokesman of the Registrar General's office. There is no comparable official figure for the year 2000, but it must be in the region of 5 to 7 million, approximately 1/10 of the whole population, and approaching that of Greater London. Of course, it will not be evenly distributed from Margate to Aberystwyth, and from Penzance to Aberdeen. Whole areas, towns and parts of towns across England will be occupied by sections of the immigrant and immigrant-descended population. As time goes on, the proportion of this total who are immigrant descendants, those born in England, who arrived here by exactly the same route as the rest of us, will rapidly increase. Already by 1985, the native-born will constitute the majority. It is this fact which creates the extreme urgency of action now, of just that kind of action which is hardest for politicians to take, action where the difficulties lie in the present, but the evils to be prevented or minimised lie several parliaments ahead. The natural and rational first question with the nation confronted by such a prospect is to ask, how can its dimensions be reduced? Granted it be not wholly preventable, can it be limited, bearing in mind that numbers are of the essence? The significance and consequences of an alien element introduced into a country or population are profoundly different according to whether that element is 1% or 10%. The answers to the simple and rational question are equally simple and rational. By stopping, or virtually stopping, further inflow, and by promoting the maximum outflow. Both answers are part of the official policy of the Conservative Party. It almost passes belief that at this moment 20 or 30 additional immigrant children are arriving from overseas in Wolverhampton alone every week, and that means 15 or 20 additional families a decade or two hence. Those whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad. We must be mad, literally mad, as a nation, to be permitting the annual inflow of some 50,000 dependents, who are, for the most part, the material of the future growth of the immigrant-descended population. It is like watching a nation busily engaged in heaping up its own funeral pyre. So insane are we that we actually permit unmarried persons to immigrate for the purpose of founding a family with spouses and fiancés whom they have never seen. Let no one suppose that the flow of dependents will automatically tail off. On the contrary, even at the present admission rate of only 5,000 a year by voucher, there is sufficient for a further 25,000 dependents per annum ad infinitum, without taking into account the huge reservoir of existing relations in this country, and I am making no allowance at all for fraudulent entry. In these circumstances, nothing will suffice but that the total outflow for settlement should be reduced at once to negligible proportions, and that the necessary legislative and administrative measures be taken without delay. I stress the words "for settlement." This has nothing to do with the entry of Commonwealth citizens, any more than of aliens, into this country, for the purposes of study or of improving their qualifications, like, for instance, the Commonwealth doctors who, to the advantage of their own countries, have enabled our hospital service to be expanded faster than would have otherwise been possible. They are not, and never have been, immigrants. I turn to re-emigration. If all immigration ended tomorrow, the rate of growth of the immigrant and immigrant-descended population would be substantially reduced, but the prospective size of this element in the population would still leave the basic character of the national danger unaffected. This can only be tackled while a considerable proportion of the total still comprises persons who entered this country during the last 10 years or so. Hence the urgency of implementing now the second element of the Conservative Party's policy, the encouragement of re-emigration. Nobody can make an estimate of the numbers which, with generous assistance, would choose either to return to their countries of origin or to go to other countries anxious to receive the manpower and the skills they represent. Nobody knows, because no such policy has been attempted. I can only say that, even at the present, immigrants in my own constituency from time to time come to me, asking if I can find them assistance to return home. If such a policy were adopted and pursued with the determination which the gravity of the alternative justifies, the resultant outflow could appreciably alter the prospects. The third element of the Conservative Party's policy is that all who are in this country as citizens should be equal before the law, and that there should be no discrimination or difference made between them by public authority. As Mr. Heath has put it, we will have no first-class citizens and second-class citizens. This does not mean that the immigrant and his descendant should be elevated into a privileged or special class, or that the citizen should be denied his right to discriminate in the management of his own affairs between one fellow citizen and another, or that he should be subjected to imposition as to his reasons and his motive for behaving in one lawful manner rather than another. There could be no greater misconception of the realities than is entertained by those who vociferously demand legislation, as they call it, against discrimination, whether they be leader writers of the same kidney and sometimes on the same newspapers which year after year in the 1930s tried to blind this country to the rising peril which confronted it, or archbishops who live in palaces, faring delicately with the bedclothes pulled up right over their heads. They have got it exactly and diametrically wrong. The discrimination and the deprivation, the sense of alarm and of resentment, lies not with the immigrant population, but with those among whom they have come and are still coming. This is why to enact legislation of this kind before Parliament at this moment is to risk throwing a match onto gunpowder. The kindest thing that can be said about those who propose and support it is that they know not what they do. Nothing is more misleading than comparison between the Commonwealth immigrant in Britain and the American Negro. The Negro population of the United States, which was already in existence before the United States became a nation, started literally as slaves and were later given the franchise and other rights of citizenship, to the exercise of which they have only gradually and still incompletely come. The Commonwealth immigrant came to Britain as a full citizen, to a country which knew no discrimination between one citizen and another, and he entered instantly into the possession of the rights of every citizen, from the vote to free treatment under the National Health Service. Whatever drawbacks attended the immigrants arose not from the law, or from public policy, or from administration, but from those personal circumstances and accidents which cause, and always will cause, the fortunes and experience of one man to be different from another's. But while, to the immigrant, entry to this country was admission to privileges and opportunities eagerly sought, the impact upon the existing population was very different, for reasons which they could not comprehend, and in pursuance of a decision by default on which they were never consulted, they found themselves made strangers in their own country. They found their wives unable to obtain hospital beds in childbirth, their children unable to obtain school places, their homes and neighbourhoods changed beyond recognition, their plans and prospects for the future defeated. At work, they found that employers hesitated to apply to the immigrant worker the standards of discipline and competence required of the native-born worker. They began to hear, as time went by, more and more voices which told them that they were now the unwanted. They now learned that a one-way privilege is to be established by Act of Parliament, a law which cannot, and is not intended to, operate to protect them or redress their grievances, is to be enacted to give the stranger, the disgruntled, and the agent provocateur the power to pillory them for their private actions. In the hundreds upon hundreds of letters I received when I last spoke on this subject 2 or 3 months ago, there was one striking feature which was largely new and which I find ominous. All members of Parliament are used to the typical anonymous correspondent, but what surprised and alarmed me was the high proportion of ordinary, decent, sensible people writing a rational and often well-educated letter, who believed that they had to omit their address, because it was dangerous to have committed themselves to paper to a Member of Parliament agreeing with the views I had expressed, and that they would risk penalties or reprisals if they were known to have done so. The sense of being a persecuted minority which is growing among ordinary English people in the areas of the country which are affected is something that those without direct experience can hardly imagine. The other dangerous delusion from which those who are wilfully or otherwise blind to realities suffer is summed up in the word integration. To be integrated into a population means to become, for all practical purposes, indistinguishable from its other members. Now, at all times where there are marked physical differences, especially of colour, integration is difficult, though, over a period, not impossible. There are among the Commonwealth immigrants who have come to live here in the last 15 years or so, many thousands whose wish and purpose is to be integrated, and whose every thought and endeavour is bent in that direction. But to imagine that such a thing enters the heads of a great and growing majority of immigrants and their descendants is a ludicrous misconception and a dangerous one. We are on the verge here of a change. Hitherto it has been the force of circumstance and a background which has rendered the very idea of integration inaccessible to the greater part of the immigrant population, that they never conceived or intended such a thing, and that their numbers and physical concentration meant the pressures towards integration which normally bear upon any small minority did not operate. Now we are seeing the growth of positive forces acting against integration, of vested interests in the preservation and sharpening of racial and religious differences, with a view to the exercise of actual domination, first over fellow immigrants and then over the rest of the population. As I look ahead, I am filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood. That tragic and intractable phenomenon which we watch with horror on the other side of the Atlantic, but which there is interwoven with the history and existence of the States itself, is coming upon us here by our own volition and our own neglect. Indeed, it has all but come. In numerical terms, it will be of American proportions long before the end of the century. Only resolute and urgent action will avert it even now. Whether there will be the public will to demand and obtain that action, I do not know. All I know is that to see, and not to speak, would be the great betrayal. Analysis. The day after this speech was given, Sunday the 21st of April, Powell was sacked from the Conservative shadow cabinet by leader Edward Heath under pressure as several Tory MPs threatened to resign if he remained on the front bench. In the days which followed, there were many demonstrations held by working-class English communities. On Tuesday the 23rd of April, 3 days after the speech, 1,000 placard-brandishing London dockers went on strike in protest at his dismissal and marched to the Palace of Westminster. The following day, 600 St Catherine dock workers voted to strike, and factory workers across the country joined them. 600 more workers from Smithfield Market marched to Westminster and handed Powell a 92-page petition supporting him. By Saturday the 27th of April, 4,500 dockers were on strike. An interesting point to note is that these striking workers were likely almost entirely Labour voters. The supreme function of statesmanship is to provide against preventable evils is a fantastic first line, which sets the tone for the rest of the speech. Powell is clear that he understands the content of this speech will be controversial, that it may stir up trouble and inflame feelings, but he feels that he simply does not have the right to shrug his shoulders and think about something else. He makes the point that people are disposed to mistake predicting troubles for causing troubles, and even for desiring troubles. It has now become very common to see people who believe it is the act of bringing attention to underlying issues caused by demographic change that is dangerous, not the demographic change itself. This is why it seems to have become the case that the native Briton who openly criticises mass immigration or minorities is treated more disfavourably in the media than the immigrant who literally harms children. It is why the media choose to focus on the far-right response to the recent stabbing of children and teachers at a primary school in Dublin, while failing to mention that the attack was perpetrated by an Algerian migrant. But who cares about the victims? They are unimportant, simply necessary sacrifices at the squalid altar of multiculturalism. Drawing attention to the problem, that's the real problem. Pointing out the fact that the Dublin stabbings would not have happened had Ireland not opened up its floodgates to the Third World, that is the problem. It is why Conor McGregor is now the subject of an inquiry into the dissemination of online hate speech for tweeting his reasonable opinions about the state of Ireland and calling its immigration system a failed system. Here is another statement from McGregor. "We are not backing down, we are only warming up. There will be no backing down until real change is implemented for the safety of our nation. We are not losing any more of our women and children to sick and twisted people who should not even be in Ireland in the first place. Call it what you want. We do not care. May God help us all. Ireland for victory." If only we had high-profile people in Britain willing to publicly say such things. Back to Powell. He continues, saying, "At all events, the discussion of future grave but, with effort now, avoidable evils is the most unpopular and at the same time the most necessary occupation for the politicians. If only all politicians thought this way, all the failures of our multicultural experiment could have been avoided. Politicians are afraid to make tough decisions which may, in the short term, be unpopular, but which hold the long-term interests of the nation at heart. They instead prefer to kick the can down the road, hoping that someone else will do it. In this country, in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man. This is the line which detractors most often point to as evidence of Powell's racist fear-mongering. Such people are often remiss to include some important context for this line, namely that it was part of a quote from one of Powell's constituents, not his own words. It is a testament to Powell's respect for regular Englishmen that he was willing to put his career on the line in order to make their voices heard. Despite the blowback this speech caused, he was representing the views of the silent majority at the time, ordinary men and women, understandably cautious about the great demographic changes which loomed on the horizon, and the very real prospect of a diminution in living standards for their children. As his constituent, the ordinary working man, said, "I have 3 children. I shan't be satisfied till I have seen them all settled overseas." This certainly was on the minds of hundreds of thousands at the time, and continues to be an important issue for millions now. When people ask why I am so vocal about the issues in this country, I often think of Powell's line. I simply do not have the right to shrug my shoulders and think about something else. In more concrete terms, I want to have children, and I want my future children, as well as my nieces and nephews, to grow up in the England of my youth, not the culture-barren, anarcho-tyrannic economic zone it is fast becoming. Nevertheless, the whip hand statement is now inexorably associated with and attributed to Powell. So was he right? Well, despite making up 3.5% of the UK population, blacks are vastly overrepresented in UK advertising. Job postings for the BBC routinely feature statements to the effect of "whites need not apply." The case can be made that the most structurally disadvantaged group in Britain at this moment is white working class men. On the whip hand question, while it would probably be hyperbolic to say that it is currently the case that the black man has the whip hand over the white man, the trend certainly seems to be travelling in that direction. Blacks, at least in the media and academic settings, certainly enjoy a disproportionate influence. In the post-BLM era, the influence of critical race theory has increased exponentially. He continues, "There are areas that are already undergoing the total transformation to which there is no parallel in 1,000 years of English history." He is absolutely correct. We have had more immigration into this country in the last 20 years than in the country's entire history. How anybody could claim that this doesn't affect the culture of the native peoples is nonsensical. In the current paradigm, natives of all European countries are expected to censor themselves and their culture in order to be more inclusive to the newcomers. The scale of the demographic shift in Britain is not spoken about often enough. 1 in 6 people living in England and Wales were born outside of the UK. That is 10 million people in a combined population of 60 million. In England, population 55 million, 10.7 million people identified as something other than white, according to the 2021 census data. Note that white includes non-English Europeans, such as the 743,000 Poles and 539,000 Romanians residing here. It is a source of great frustration that the census insists on lumping British in with English, Welsh, Scottish and Northern Irish, as it muddies the waters and makes it impossible to differentiate between native Britons and those who are British by naturalisation or by dint of being born in Britain. In any case, in 2021, 74.4%, 44.4 million participants identified themselves as white British. That is a decrease from 2011, which saw 80.5%, or 45.1 million, identify as such, and 2001, which saw 87.5%, or 45.5 million. In 20 short years, the white British population has actually dropped by 1 million, while the total population has grown by 8 million. The white British population has dropped by 13% in 20 years. Again, this data is skewed because it includes anybody who identifies as white British. It will include many children of European immigrants, so it fails to tell the full story of the demographic decline of native Britons. Powell says, there is no official prediction for numbers of immigrants and their descendants for the year 2000, but it must be in the region of 5 to 7 million, approximately 1/10 of the whole population. He was correct. By 2001, the white British section of the population had fallen to 85.6%, leaving the non-white and non-British population at a little over 14%. He goes on to make a prediction which has undoubtedly been proven correct. Whole areas, towns and parts of towns across England will be occupied by sections of the immigrant and immigrant-descended population. Some of our largest and most important cities, London, Birmingham, Manchester and Leicester, are now majority-minority cities. There are London boroughs in which as many as 48% of residents are foreign-born. In Slough, Luton, London, Cambridge, Leicester, Oxford, Watford and Manchester, more than half of all births are to non-UK-born mothers. Citizenship. As time goes on, the proportion of this total who are immigrant descendants, those born in England, who arrived here by exactly the same route as the rest of us, will rapidly increase. Already by 1985, the native-born would constitute the majority. It is this fact which creates the extreme urgency of action now, of just that kind of action which is hardest for politicians to take. action where the difficulties lie in the present, but the evils to be prevented or minimized lie several parliaments ahead. This is one of the starkest issues of modern-day politics, the inability for politicians, frozen like deer in headlights, to act in situations where present action is needed to prevent a future danger, but the present action would be politically unsavory. I think what Powell was getting at here is that the children of immigrants pose a challenge because they will be much more difficult to get rid of than those who physically moved here, due to the liberal consensus that being born in a place automatically makes one just as indigenous as one who is a descendant of the people to whom the land belongs. As such, it is better to nip the problem in the bud sooner rather than later, as the children of immigrants will be able to make the argument that this is, in fact, just as much my home as yours, as they do today. There are two major conceptions of how citizenship ought to be granted. There is jus soli, right of soil, in which citizenship is conferred by the physical location of birth, and jus sanguinis, right of blood, in which a nation guarantees citizenship to the offspring of its citizens even if the child is born elsewhere. Jus sanguinis is applied across multiple generations in some countries. Many countries have a mixed system whereby they offer citizenship to children born of foreigners in their country and also guarantee the right for children of their citizens born abroad to receive citizenship. We have reached a point now where, following successive generations of immigration, it is really quite difficult to make the argument that Britain is for the British and all non-Britons here are guests in our nation. But as we move into a post-liberal world in the coming decades, many liberal assumptions will have to be renegotiated, and we can begin to make the case that all who are non-native Britons, that is, not an Englishman, a Welshman or a Scot in Britain, only enjoy British residency on a condition of privilege, not by right, and that those criminals who are able to acquire citizenship in another nation by jus sanguinis will be involuntarily repatriated, that is, stripped of UK citizenship if they have it, and deported to their country of origin. Moving forward, it may be useful to advocate a restriction in the jus soli right to UK citizenship for children who are eligible for citizenship by jus sanguinis in the country of their parents. In case any of this sounds unnecessarily harsh, note that many countries have only begun offering citizenship based on jus soli since the 1990s and early 2000s, and many of those countries still only offer it on the condition that one or more of the parents is a citizen of the country, and in some cases an ethnic national. Powell continues, the natural and rational first question with a nation confronted by such a prospect is to ask, how can its dimensions be reduced? Granted immigration be not wholly preventable, can it be limited, bearing in mind that numbers are of the essence? The significance and consequences of an alien element introduced into a country or population are profoundly different according to whether that element is 1% or 10%. The answers to the simple and rational question are equally simple and rational. By stopping, or virtually stopping, further inflow, and by promoting the maximum outflow, both answers are part of the official policy of the Conservative Party. How far the Conservative Party has fallen since Powell's day. Note that this speech was given while the Tories were in opposition, intended to sell their policies to voters. They were once advocating a vast reduction in immigration numbers, and even going so far as to promote a net outflow, a remigration of immigrants. Such talk of stopping further inflow and promoting the maximum outflow would probably be considered hate speech today. Such is the leftward shift of the Overton window that we feel unable to say these things. That must change. He is absolutely correct to make the point that the impact immigration will have on a population is quite different depending on the numbers. A 1% immigrant and immigrant-descended population is radically different from 10%. As it stands, our immigrant and immigrant-descended population has reached at least 25%, and there are no signs of this demographic shift slowing. Hence why celebrations of native culture are now seen as non-inclusive and xenophobic, and we are inundated with bad faith questions such as, what is English culture anyway? Our politicians try in vain to sell us the obvious lie that diversity is our strength, but it is only rubbing salt in the wounds. They have already rubbed our noses in diversity, Now they expect us to parrot their tired lines and pretend that mass demographic replacement is beneficial to us, our culture, and our nation. The Conservative Party has, since the late 1990s, been irrevocably infected with that most hideous of diseases, Blairism. That political leprosy which ensures a slow, painful decay of culture and nationhood. Recall that in 2009, the last full year of a Labour government in this country, net immigration was a relatively puny 169,000. Tony Blair was certainly a decisive factor in orchestrating the decline of this country, but it was the Conservative Party which perpetuated and scaled up his destructive project. Those whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad. We must be mad, literally mad, as a nation, to be permitting the annual inflow of some 50,000 dependents, who are for the most part the material of the future growth of the immigrant-descended population. It is like watching a nation busily engaged in heaping up its own funeral pyre. What we wouldn't give for the numbers to be as low as only tens of thousands at this point. The political class certainly has gone mad, believing that the interests of the British people are best served by importing literally millions of foreigners in a matter of decades, practically ensuring that the process of integration is unable to play out properly, as well as putting massive strain on our public services and drastically diminishing the quality of life of our working class population. While there are, naturally, demented sections of the populace which believe that mass immigration is an unequivocal good, the voices of the majority either fall on deaf ears or are hand waved off as merely the bigoted ramblings of gammons. Continuing, Powell states that, if all immigration ended tomorrow, the rate of growth of the immigrant and immigrant-descended population would be substantially reduced, but the prospective size of this element in the population would still leave the basic character of the national danger unaffected. 56 years on, the prophetic quality of this speech is clear to see. We faltered for too long, too squeamish to make a decisive move on this issue, to nip it in the bud before it became an overwhelming task, too large for swift and relatively painless action. It was simply more expedient for the politicians of Powell's day to ignore the growing danger and continue business as usual. As a result, the national danger has only grown as immigration has been continued and expanded, and any solutions will be expensive, controversial, and complicated. Powell states that the problem can only be tackled while a considerable proportion of the total still comprises persons who entered this country during the last 10 years or so. In 2023, 1 in 6 people living in England and Wales were born in neither England nor Wales. This figure, of course, does not include our large immigrant-descended population. It is only people who physically moved here. Not only have we delayed finding a solution to this issue for 60 years, we are increasing the scope of the problem year upon year. In consistently deferring to the future the task of finding a solution, it has been ensured that the task grows exponentially more complex and fraught with moral implications. We have allowed space for sentiments to grow, such as "London was built by immigrants." We have allowed our guests to stay for long enough, comfortably enough, without being sufficiently pressured to integrate, that they now feel justified in making an equal claim to ownership of Britain as the natives. In the era of human rights, it has become increasingly difficult to make the arguments which Powell makes in this speech. Powell quotes Edward Heath, Conservative Party leader at the time of the speech, as saying, "We will have no first-class citizens and second-class citizens," but continues, "This does not mean that the immigrant should be elevated into a privileged or special class. In any other period of history, this would just be common sense, something which simply did not need to be said. However, in our Western minoritarian societies, such a privileging has, in the last few decades, been fast becoming de facto the case." The other dangerous delusion from those who are willfully or otherwise blind to realities suffer is summed up in the word integration. To be integrated into a population means to become, for all practical purposes, indistinguishable from its other members. Now, at all times, where there are marked physical differences, especially of colour, integration is difficult, though, over a period, not impossible. There are, among the Commonwealth immigrants who have come to live here in the last 15 years or so, many thousands whose wish and purpose is to be integrated and whose every thought and endeavour is bent in that direction. but to imagine that such a thing enters the heads of a great and growing majority of immigrants and their descendants is a ludicrous misconception and a dangerous one. This is a point which has been made countless times in recent decades, but it is a point which bears repeating ad nauseum until it sinks into the heads of all concerned. Integration is only possible with a very small rate of immigration. As Powell says, it may be more difficult to integrate people who possess marked physical differences because their foreignness is immediately identifiable. It is far easier for a third-generation descendant of Poles to be perceived as, and to perceive himself as, English than it is for a Nigerian. There are three factors which determine the success of the integration process. The first is a question of numbers. The more people immigrating in any given period, the more difficult the process of integration will be. Integration is only really possible when there is a strong native culture into which to integrate, and to which the immigrants themselves feel a pressure to conform. Natives are also more comfortable with slow-scale change, accepting a trickle of immigrants rather than a tidal wave, which throws their community off balance. The immigration statistics speak for themselves. We are simply importing far too many people year on year. The second factor has to do with the type of immigrant. A European with a fairly similar culture to that of Britain, such as a German, who also possesses the privilege of looking essentially the same as the average Briton, will have a far easier time of the integration process than, say, an Arab or a Pakistani, who are not only raised in cultures which are markedly foreign to these isles, but are also immediately identifiable as outsiders. Of the top 10 countries of origin of immigrants in this country, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, South Africa, Nigeria, and China feature. These are all countries with vastly different cultures to Britain. Of course, we see, for example, Pakistani enclaves in towns like Luton. There is no real pressure to integrate. As Powell rightly states, their numbers and physical concentration meant the pressures towards integration which normally bear upon any small minority did not operate. The third factor is the diversity of immigration backgrounds. An influx of 50,000 Pakistanis at once would be exceedingly more difficult to integrate than 50,000 people made up of an even spread of people from 50 different countries. The first example would inevitably lead to the formation of a sizable enclave in which the immigrants are free to speak their own language, not even necessarily needing to learn English, as the majority of their day-to-day lives would take place surrounded by their own people. As far back as 2016, it was estimated that 190,000 Muslim women in England spoke little or no English. This number has presumably ballooned since then. We in the current day tend to believe that everything was basically sane until around 10 or 15 years ago. While it is true that the political climate has rapidly polarized in that time, reading old speeches such as this one really puts things into perspective. The following quote, from 56 years ago, shows that the racial grifting and agitation on the part of ethnic minorities is nothing new. Now we are seeing the growth of positive forces acting against integration, of vested interests in the preservation and sharpening of racial and religious differences, with a view to the exercise of actual domination, first over fellow immigrants and then over the rest of the population. While of course the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020 supercharged the cause of creating divisions along racial lines in order to gain privileges for minorities, this has been going on for a while. It is simply more obvious now, in television, in the erasure of native Britons from their own history, in truly pointless displays of diversity plastered all over the country. If the aim was to make racism a thing of the past, surely the best method to achieve that aim would be to stop talking about race. Instead, the topic of race cannot be escaped. It is pushed in our faces incessantly. It serves a single purpose, stoking division, in two ways. Firstly, it is designed to bring more ethnic minorities on board with the cause, to identify with their perceived victimhood and oppression under a cruel white supremacist system. Secondly, it is to anger natives who question why any of this even bears talking about, and to alienate them in their own country. It should be noted that Powell did not refer to this as the Rivers of Blood speech. He always called it the Birmingham Speech. Now on to that infamous line. As I look ahead, I am filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood. Apocalyptic language, certainly, but it takes the kind of ignorance and cynicism only a leftist or a liar could conjure to willfully misinterpret this line as anything other than a metaphor. In any case, while things have slumped along lethargically for now, the future of Britain absolutely is at stake unless something is done about the demographic situation. As Powell says, ending the speech, only resolute and urgent action will avert it even now. Whether there will be the public will to demand and obtain that action, I do not know. All I know is that to see and not to speak would be the great betrayal. But nobody acted to avert it. In my more pessimistic moods, I truly despair at the state of this country. But pessimism, no matter how warranted, must be set aside. It is a tool in the arsenal of the enemy within, intended to demoralize us and render us unable to push back against their plans. The final line, all I know is that to see and not to speak would be the great betrayal, is simply breathtaking. What a succinct distillation of our duty as Englishmen and as Britons. We see what is happening around us, and we have an obligation to speak, lest we betray the memory and work of our ancestors who built this great nation that it might be passed on to us. By remaining silent, we also betray our future generations for whom we are entrusted with this civilization, so that they may enjoy it in the future. It is truly frightening to put one's head above the parapet, but this beautiful nation will crumble if we do not muster up the courage to defend it from the onslaught. The time for fear has passed. The time for honest debate has come. You see the imminent threat. Now is the time to speak. If you value Britain, it is your duty.